Welcome, everybody. My name is Keith Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, and we're extremely honored today to have an extraordinary interview with a global leader who is helping us to put us on a path of sustainability. I think all of us know the extraordinary threats our planet are facing right now. Those threats face not only all species on the planet, but they also, of course, threaten ourselves. A global leader who has been working tirelessly throughout her career to be able to put us on a path to sustainability is our guest today. And it's the Executive Director of the UN Environment Program, Inge Andersen. Ms. Andersen, prior to being the Executive Director of UNEP, was the Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And prior to that, she was a Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. And I can say that Ms. Andersen has truly been a tireless worker for the planet and for all of us throughout her career, and it's a real honor to have her here today. Inge, welcome, and thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
being on the interview today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
We know that UNEP has it sees the world as having three overriding planetary crises: the climate change crises, biodiversity and nature, and water and pollution. And I think we're going to focus, as we agreed to, on the middle part, on biodiversity and the nature crisis, and to inform the scientific community the challenges and the opportunities embedded within this. But first, perhaps you could share with us what is natural capital, and why is natural capital important to all species, including our own?
Well, we those of us who have traveled the economics journey, we are aware of and we understand that we have, in traditional economics, we have the human capital, we have physical capital, production capital, and we have financial capital. But the point here is that we need to understand that nature, that basic, you call it for a moment capital, that basic elementary foundational nature and ecosystems, that stock of that capital, the plants, the animals, the air, the water, the soils, the minerals, all of that, if we mess with that, all the other things come crumbling. And so it is an understanding, therefore, that and it is not about putting dollar signs on bees and trees and monetizing nature, no, but it's to understand that yes, you can fish the proverbial oceans empty and have a great quarterly return, but then what? Yes, you can cut that forest down and have a great timber product, and then what? The point is that we cannot assume that we can emit into, cause effluent into that nature and just expect it to continue to regenerate. So with that then, and understanding that nature has a worth to society, that true value of our goods and services is not today reflected in our market economy. There is this assumption that it's inexhaustible, and yet we know that if we continue, and as we currently are doing, we're sort of consuming, we need 1.6 planets. So understanding natural capital and integrating it into our statistics, that's what we need to do. And we at UNEP are working very much within the UN Statistical Division and with many governments precisely to do that. And 2 weeks from now, and this is a big thing, and so those who may be listening, the UK Her Majesty's Treasury are coming out with a report that is, if you like, the sister report to the Nick Stern report of 2008, the new climate economy. It speaks to the economics of biodiversity, and it speaks to treating nature as an asset class. It's very exciting to have a treasury of that in the G7 come out with this. And so when economists that are leading an economy says pay attention to nature or face ruin, it's probably worthwhile.
And it's not purely an issue of aesthetics by any stretch of the imagination. Biodiversity is not a luxury. In fact, as you point out, it's actually essential to all lives, to our health, to our economies, and to much more. Can you delve more importantly into that? Because I think a lot of people don't necessarily see the threat the loss of biodiversity poses to all of us.
It's true. I mean, because people see sort of a butterfly here and an orchid there going extinct, and even when a big charismatic like the white rhino, which is set to go extinct, and of course we lost the last rhino in Sudan. We have 2 females left. That's not a white rhino. But Sudan was that. It lived in Kenya, but it was called Sudan. That last male rhino that died a few weeks back. Now, the point here is that when you see a species or another going extinct, people may think, yeah, that's part of the natural order of things. We don't have dinosaurs on the planet anymore. Things go extinct. Yes, they do. There is a natural extinction rate. However, we need to understand that we are by far, far, far exceeding that. And so what does that matter? It matters a great deal. Today, the IPBES, which is a very long acronym that essentially is the panel of a multilateral panel of scientists that looks at biodiversity and biodiversity services. It's a sister panel to the IPCC, the panel on climate change science. That panel says we have about 7.8 million species on this good earth. And if we continue as we are, we're set to lose 1 million within this current century. Now, what does that do? Well, it means that nature is this finely attuned system where everything relies on everything, where a species will host in one, live in another, eat a third, and nest in a fourth, etc., and be relying on the climate and on the regularity of climate, on a clean, non-polluted environment. And all of that supports you and I. Supports the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, and everything else. That's back to the natural capital, the sort of foundational aspect. And so when we have today altered about 75% of the ice-free surface, terrestrial surface of our planet, and 66% of our marine, we have to think about that alteration. How can nature that essentially allows us that ability to live and to thrive sustain itself when it is under attack? The Secretary General calls it a war on nature, the Secretary General of the United Nations. So, and I'm speaking to a health community, and who knows better than the health community about zoonosis? And so that's obviously a concern that comes right home, and we can dive into that. But biodiversity is also more than that, because it's what defines a nation. It's what defines our identity, our cultural value. And when we were locked in, or in many cases still are locked in view of the COVID-19 lockdown, what's the first thing we do when we are allowed to go out? We go into nature. We don't go into the shopping mall, I think. We go into nature because we as human beings need to connect. There are doctors, medical doctors, who today prescribe nature, RX nature, for stress, for obviously cardiovascular diseases, etc. So there is that dimension, but there is a very foundational dimension of food and air and water, etc. And then there are, of course, the issues that we get, again, is it around 75% of our medicinal products have an originally derived natural element in them. Today, maybe they're synthetically produced. So we kind of need to think about our nature as a Library of Congress. And then we need to understand that the moment we lose nature services, the scrubbing of the air, the storing of our carbon, the producing the global hydrological cycle that produces our rains, that regulates our weather patterns, and that pollinates our crops. We can't afford to lose them. There are countries where you have to do mechanical pollination. It adds a huge dimension of cost. So getting that and understanding that intricate relationship is something that really matters to our health, but also to the health of our societies and our economies.
And those are powerful words, but it describes it well: the war on nature, the tearing apart of the fragile network of life that we have. And you made a number of excellent points. It's not only about zoonoses and food security. So there's a cost to the failure to act, but there are also benefits to act. And UNEP's doing excellent work in this space to protect biodiversity. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're working across the world with projects supporting countries in any number of settings. And we'll probably get into that, but we base everything we do on science and on knowledge that we have. But so to a large extent, we're working with countries on legal frameworks and to ensure that they can set in place the kind of frameworks that enables protection, enforcement. So there's that side. But there's also working with businesses for businesses to understand how they can lessen, reduce, or work in nature positive ways. Because we have to understand that when we look around us, we are surrounded by things that are extracted from nature, metal, wood. I mean, just take a look around the room that any one of us is sitting in. And these things we do need. So how can we create these products and having less of a footprint? How can we produce our food and having less of a fragmentation of nature impact? How can we cause the effluent that we do cause and mitigate the impacts? And so we work with businesses, we work with countries and we work with communities across the world. Part in protecting, so protected areas management, all of that, the sort of purest biodiversity conservation, if you like, but also nature positive farming, reduced chemical input farming or zero input chemical input farming, ensuring that there are corridors for migratory species. So there's that work, and then there is the work, as I mentioned, working with really top corporate organizations to enable that they can produce the services that you and I need, but doing so without having that nature negative impact, or at least to mitigate it to the extent possible. We're also working very much with the financial institutions, because after all, it's the asset managers writ large that manages the big institutional investors, the pension funds, etc. Where will they put their investments? Will it be nature negative or nature positive? Will it be climate negative or climate positive? So it's through an initiative called UNEP Financial Initiative. We have signed up trillions of dollars of institutional investors and bankers that have made the commitment transparently to seek to align, not to seek to align their investment portfolio. You can't turn it on a dime between now and 2030, so the SDG period, with regular check-ins on how they're doing to align it with those kind of dimensions that I speak of. So these are important and critical elements, because UNEP alone, we are but a tiny group. We can only impact if we impact into society, to government, to community, and to finance and economy. That's what we seek to do.
And I just wanted to another key point you made, and particularly for the global health community, an area that's neglected surprisingly, or as you mentioned, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, mental health being the leading cause of disability in the world, and that bucket of diseases called non-communicable diseases representing 70% of deaths worldwide, and a number that's growing, a number that affects even poorer countries even harder than richer countries. That maybe is a surprise to some. So the work, the environment, as you mentioned, in protecting a natural capital, can have an impact upon non-communicable diseases, not only infectious diseases like what we're seeing now with the spillover from the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but also, as you mentioned, for that bucket of non-communicable diseases like mental health and cardiovascular disease. That should be a compelling reason for not only finance ministers and not only health ministers, but finance ministers to support the protection of natural capital, shouldn't it?
Precisely. I mean, it is spot on. I mean, all the non-communicable diseases and air pollution, I mean, there's so many of them. We know that it was over 7 million people die prematurely from air pollution, for example. And we also know that that mental health dramatically improves when you are exposed to nature. There are studies, your community will know better than mine. I only read your community studies that speak to children's brains and the neurons getting wired better when they have been exposed to nature in the toddler and developing period. And it's I mean, you take a chimpanzee and you put it in a cage, or you take it and you have it in the wild forest, and guess what? Which one is smarter? I mean, this is, I'm sorry, but we work in the animal kingdom, and there is a reality to what you learn and how you are exposed. So being exposed to nature has these tremendous benefits that often we overlook, which is why, as we are urbanizing as a planet, we really need to think about how we urbanize and bring biodiversity into the cities, make smart cities, get rid of sprawl, which is deeply alienating and often has a mental health dimension, and ensure that we have a sound and healthy and safe densification of our cities with biodiversity and richness amongst us. And enabling, we talk about this 10-minute city where everything should be available, your job, your groceries, your park, your blah blah blah, within this 10 minutes radius, because it gives better, healthier mental as well as environmental health, healthy lives. And so that's the sort of thing that we, together with our urban colleagues, work quite a lot on as well.
And that's the urbanization challenge is an extraordinary challenge, as you mentioned, Inge. The fact that we'll be growing, the world population will grow to 10 billion by 2050 is best we can recognize. But building forward better includes building healthier cities, right? And how we actually allocate land use and how we build buildings is an opportunity to build forward better to improve health and economic outcomes, isn't it?
That's right. And here nature should be, and this is where we need to re-engineer also our engineering schools, right? And our urban planning schools, because they're often taught about concrete and tar and steel and so on, which is important, don't get me wrong. But we also need to think about how can we make green buildings, and how can we make breathable buildings, and how can we make permeable surface coverings so that groundwater doesn't just run off, but that it's absorbed into the ground and doesn't just run off into the oceans and takes with it all kinds of garbage right into the oceans, but that it actually is absorbed into our groundwater. And so that opportunity is one that some countries have managed to capture if they have good planners, and it's often at the local level, and this is where individuals actually have a real say, because mayors are very, that's immediate, the sort of the local community, local government is where you are so directly connected to your governance. So don't miss the opportunity to vote in those places, you know. Take that into account, because this is where decisions directly affecting you and the next generation are taken, and where the livability of the next generation's lives, or the health of those lives will be taken. I come from Denmark, where the footprint of Copenhagen went down in years 700, 800, right? So that's a footprint. And we always say once a footprint is down, it's down forever. Copenhagen footprint is what it is. Chinese wall is still there. The pyramids are still standing. Footprint has a strong, so not designing for sprawl, designing for livability, designing for livable, healthy, and safe densification. That's a way to go. And so that we don't have this peri-urban wasteland that is carbon intensive, land intensive, fragments nature, is very ugly, frankly, and has a debilitating impact on mental health and drives vehicular culture. So all of these things are elements that we need to think about as we think about future spectrum.
And I think you know, how, as you just well described it, it really, if you stand back, it's really an extraordinary opportunity for finance ministers and health ministers and leaders to come together in an integrated fashion to build forward better, which has a cost, but the benefits, you know, are vastly greater than the costs involved, and the failure to
Absolutely.
act has extraordinary costs associated with them that that are well, they can be very damaging to any country that fails to address them. Another point I wanted to just get back to the biodiversity, because it focuses on UNEP's excellent work in the Conservation Monitoring Center,
Mm-hmm.
and in an area of biodiversity hotspots that I know, you know, your previous work leading the IUCN, um, And I think not a lot enough people know about those biodiversity hotspots that are usually close to areas where Indigenous peoples live, where some people are fairly impoverished. Can you describe, what the biodiversity hotspots are and how this is really an opportunity to not only to protect critical biodiversity, but also to improve the lives of those people who live
Yeah.
near those areas?
So we speak in biodiversity terms about protection, right? And the agreed something referred to as the Aichi targets were agreed in 2010 under the Biodiversity Convention. And here we agreed that we were going to protect 17% of terrestrial and 10% of land for protection. Now, that was fine and good. But what we didn't do, and this is why the hotspots is so important, we didn't say, yeah, but make sure you don't just protect some wasteland, but make sure that you protect where you have mega or high diversity or where you have uniqueness, i.e. something that exists that is well worth protection. So it's the quality of what we protect. Because in these places, as you rightly say, indigenous people and more traditional communities are, history shows us, by far the best protectors. And so oftentimes, however, these lands that they have either under traditional rights or under other rights protected um, are often also associated with the kind of natural extractive resources that are of interest. And so we've seen quite a lot of tension, whether it's in whichever tropical forest basin, wherever you go, and you can see that tension and the pressure that these communities are often under. But understanding that uniqueness in these particular areas and the service that these people, these indigenous often people, have provided to humanity and to generations to come as they have protected these places is way beyond what the cost of this has been. So that service of protecting tropical forests, which act as the lungs of the world, which provide us with the weather oscillation patterns that we know, for which we rely on harvest to harvest to harvest, that service is one that should not be negated. Now, in the convention negotiations, and you will see more and more references to biodiversity in newspapers during 2021, I hope, because we are going to head towards a sort of COP21 of similar proportions. It is COP15, but let's not go there. Similar to what climate change in the Paris Accord was. We are going to get, and we're aiming to get, a new agreement on biodiversity. And there, within that agreement, that hotspot notion, that understanding that what we protect has to be not only just sort of a percentage thing, but it has to be the qualitative thing that we protect. And just 2 days ago, President Macron in Paris hosted the One Planet Summit, where in fact a number of heads of states, including the head of state of Canada, was present, but many others too. And more than 50 countries, heads of state, pledged to protect 30% by 2030. So the 30 by 30 dimension, both of marine and terrestrial. We'll see where it lands in the negotiations. The point here is we want protection, clear, but we also want to understand that biodiversity outside of protected areas. That's where we're losing it the fastest, on the agricultural fields in our cities, in the peri-urban sprawl, in all of these places. And that's where we actually also need to protect. So we need to have the protected area stricto sensu, but we also need to have the protection in our daily lives. And that means the kind of chemicals we use in agriculture or in our back garden, the kind of roads that we build that fragment or enhance, the kind of flowering meadows that we set aside or not, the kind of urban parks that we have and how we treat them and manage them or not. And these are the kind of elements that we also need to include.
And you're driving these actions through science, and you've been working, UNEP works tirelessly to bridge the gap between science and policy. And frankly, one of the challenges in CUGH we're primarily scientists, more than 30,000 around the world. And one of our objectives is to bridge that gap between science and policy. And you've been doing this, your entire life. What advice could you give to our community about lessons learned from your experience and how to bridge that gap between science and policy, science and government?
I think we can learn from your community as much as you can learn from ours, but let's exchange notes. But from our side, I guess we have sort of made it unequivocally clear, and that's part of the very foundational setting of UNEP's work, that there are two foundational elements in environmental progress, and one is science and the other is law, right? If you don't know the science and if you don't have the regulatory settings, forget about it. It's all goodwill and sort of so ensuring. So we speak often about the science policy interface. So the science is where we do our heavy muscle work, right? We're proud to host the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, together with our friends at World Meteorological Organization. We're proud to host IPBES, the international panel that deals with biodiversity and ecosystem services. We're proud to have the International Resource Panel. We issue a lot of scientific assessment reports, including IPCC and IPBES, et cetera, but also the Global Chemical Outlook, Resources Outlook. We issue the emissions gap report, where we say this is how big the emissions gap is and this is how to close it. The production gap report, where we look at how much are we producing in hydrocarbon and how are we therefore needing to close that gap between production and Paris commitments. The adaptation gap report, I could go on and on. So all of that science is only so good if at the same time it leads to policy shifts. Otherwise, it's ivory tower stuff, right? So UNEP has, through the ages, and we are turning 50 in 2022, worked with establishing conventions. And that becomes the place where countries make these commitments. The Biodiversity Convention is a convention that UNEP is proud to host. We host a total of 17 conventions, no less. Some are more known than others, including one that deals with legal and illegal trade in wildlife, called CITES, one that deals with migratory species, called the Convention of Migratory Species, because the fish may be in your backyard, but tomorrow they may be in mine. Ditto for the birds. How are we going to manage them together so that I don't shoot them and you don't fish them, or whatever it is that is happening here? So there are a bunch of conventions that we manage, and that is where part of the policy bit, from the science to policy, gets enacted, because these conventions agree on standards, agree on measures that have to be set in place. And beyond that, I would say that many of our projects and programs where we work bilaterally with a country or multilaterally with an East African group or a East Asian group or what have you, we say, well, this is what the science says, and here's what the primary policy dimensions need to be. And it could be at the very community level, managing grazing, shifting agriculture, very basic stuff at the local level, or it could be at the national level in terms of new policies and new laws that parliaments have to approve. But that's kind of how we seek to do that. Do we succeed? No, or not always, because governments and political interests come and go. And so you may think that you've made a movement forward, and there's an international environmental law, this principle that is disputed, but I like it a lot, called non-regression principle. Like, once you have set a standard for an environmental principle, you can't regress. But we have seen countries walk out of treaties or conventions, etc. And obviously this is something that I cannot approve of, because once you made a commitment, it's not sort of now I'm in and now I'm out. And we're very pleased to see, obviously, that the Biden administration has made the commitment, and on day one they will rejoin Paris. And that's how it should be in multilateral setting, because otherwise it becomes a smorgasbord that you pick and choose and walk in and out. But I think that for the science policy, that steady forward march of understanding the science and therefore pushing the policy to an ever greater understanding of what the science demands. That's what we seek to do. And I'm sure that in the health community, it's the very same thing. just with different tools. You use less probably the multilateral conventions, although I will say that around COVID-19, obviously there has been a lot of multilateral discussion.
And no, absolutely true. And before we were coming to an end to the conversation, Inga, and I'd like to leave a moment for you to share any other messages for the global health community, the scientific community, before we go. But I think that, the points you make on not only having regulations but having the capacity to enforce those regulations and not be able to back down on commitments that were made are very important. And I would encourage all of the viewers of this interview to look at UNEP's work, the work they've done on mercury and ozone, on as Inga mentioned, on the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, and much more that have been highly successful. Please take a look at that. Look at the products UNEP has on their website, which are truly extraordinary and are entirely open access. In these final moments, what advice or messages would you like to give to the global health community to get back and make sure they support the extraordinary work of UNEP, which I'd like to mention. UNEP survives on 95% on basically donations to the work you're doing, which is really extraordinary. So UNEP punches well above its weight. And I hope our members can get behind and support and encourage the governments to support UNEP's work. But in the closing moments, what advice or messages would you like to give to the
I
global
think
scientific?
it's sort of the idea of two hands clapping, isn't it? Because we in the environment community don't understand sufficiently the health community, and I think the health community doesn't understand sufficiently the environment community. I'm beginning through contacts such as with yourself and my friends at WHO we're beginning to make some headway there, but really see that we cannot get human health without planetary health. And we cannot have planetary health without human health. So understanding that whether it's mercury or the sort of gray polluting side of things that we need to handle, whether it's a mental health side of things, whether it is that we cannot continue to encroach into nature and be surprised when when pathogens jump from nature to us as human beings, and then when we give it back to nature, what that does too. So it's this one health principle in its broadest terms, understanding human health, veterinary health, and the bigger planetary health that I have the pleasure of working on, that these three things are one and the same. We educate ourselves to be health professionals, environment professionals, veterinary professionals, whatever, but it's not good enough if we don't build those bridges between those knowledge communities. And the more we understand that, and the more, and it's a little bit back to the engineers, they need to understand nature and nature's forces too. The more we can understand these interconnects, the better and more sustainable a future we will build, and frankly, the healthier lives we will have. So whether it comes to mercury or ozone, where obviously we've seen some real successes in terms of UNEP's work, or whether it comes to biodiversity, which is much, much harder because it's not a single chemical or a single, pollutant, etc. These are areas where the voice of the health community can tremendously support our community. And we too, on the antimicrobial resistance, have a huge issue, for example, when it comes to pollutants in the waterways and in the soils, antimicrobial resistance pollutants. So I think that there's a constant interaction between the two communities, and the better we inform ourselves on both sides, the stronger we will be.
Thank you very much, Inga. It's a wonderful way to end, describing the fate of our planet, the fate of our natural world, and our fates are intimately entwined, and in fact are inseparable. So what the fate of the planet and the threats it faces are induced and caused by us, and therefore the way to redress those challenges is also in our hands too. Executive Director Inga Andersen, Executive Director of the UN Environment Program, thank you very much for sharing your views today to the global health community and indeed the world. We wish you the very best of luck. Know at CUGH you have an ally in us, and we stand with you to be able to improve the fate of our planet and indeed ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.